With her frozen fingers trembling and death closing in, Sarah thrust her infant daughter toward the solitary Apache, begging him to save her baby as she collapsed into the snow. Instead of taking only the child, he gathered them both into his powerful arms and whispered, "You'll both live here now, forever altering the course of 3 broken lives." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The snow fell in relentless sheets, each flake another layer of suffering on Sarah Calloway's frozen shoulders. The young woman staggered forward, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid mountain air. Her feet, wrapped in torn boots, sank deep into the growing drifts as the wind howled its mournful song through the pines of the Colorado wilderness. 3 days had passed since her car had slid off the remote mountain road, tumbling into a ravine far from any traveled path. 3 days of wandering, hoping for salvation, clinging to the only warmth that mattered. "Hold on, Emma," she whispered, pressing the bundle against her chest tighter. "Just a little longer." The infant, only 3 months old, whimpered softly beneath the layers of clothing Sarah had wrapped around her tiny body. The child's cries had grown weaker with each passing hour, a fact that terrified the young mother more than her own numbing limbs or the hunger that clawed at her insides. Sarah was 28, a widow whose husband James had never lived to see their daughter's birth. The military telegram had arrived just 2 months before Emma came into the world. "A training accident," they said. "Condolences from a grateful nation," words that meant nothing when facing the vast emptiness of raising a child alone. And now, lost in this white wilderness, Sarah feared she had failed at the only promise that mattered, keeping their daughter safe. The daylight was fading fast, the temperature plummeting with the setting sun. Sarah's legs trembled with each step, her vision blurring at the edges. But something caught her eye. A thin wisp of smoke rising above the tree line, almost invisible against the grey winter sky. "Please," she prayed, changing direction toward that faint hope. "Please be real." She pushed forward, her muscles screaming in protest. The snow seemed to fight against her, growing deeper, the wind more biting. Emma had fallen silent against her chest, a silence that sent terror through Sarah's heart. "No, no, baby girl. Stay with me," she pleaded, awkwardly removing her glove with her teeth to touch her daughter's cheek. It was cool, too cool. "Emma, please." The smoke grew closer, and through the swirling snow, Sarah made out the silhouette of a cabin. Small, sturdy, with a stone chimney pushing warmth into the hostile sky. A figure moved in the yard, bent over a chopping block. Sarah forced her frozen legs to move faster, stumbling through the final stretch. The figure straightened, a tall man with broad shoulders and long dark hair tied back from his face. His features were sharp, his skin weathered and copper against the snow. He turned at the sound of her approach, one hand instinctively reaching for something at his belt. "Help," Sarah managed, the word barely audible through her cracked lips. "My baby." The man's dark eyes widened as he took in the sight of her, a half-frozen woman clutching a silent bundle. His expression shifted from wariness to alarm. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees before him. The last of her strength deserted her, and in a desperate act of maternal sacrifice, she extended Emma toward him. "Take her," she pleaded, tears freezing on her cheeks. I can't go on. Save my baby. Please." The man stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then he moved with surprising gentleness, kneeling in the snow before her. But instead of taking only the child, his strong arms encircled them both. "You'll both live here now," he said, his voice deep and accented, but clear. "This mountain has room for fighters like you." Sarah felt herself being lifted, cradled against his chest alongside her daughter. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the door of the cabin swinging open and the blessed promise of warmth beyond. Inside, Dakota Two Rivers laid the woman and child gently on the buffalo hide beside his hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows across their pale faces as he worked quickly, removing wet clothes, checking for frostbite, and wrapping them in warm blankets. He had not welcomed a stranger into his home in 7 winters, not since the fever had taken his wife and son. Yet something in this woman's eyes, the fierce love that burned even as her body failed, had awakened something he thought long dead within him. Dawn crept through the small window of the cabin, painting stripes of pale gold across the rough-hewn floor. Sarah awoke with a violent start, her body jerking upright, heart hammering against her ribs. "Emma!" she cried, hands frantically searching the blankets around her. "Here!" came a deep voice from across the room. "The little one is here." Sarah's vision cleared, focusing on the figure sitting in a wooden chair near the crackling fire. Dakota held Emma in his arms, cradled with surprising tenderness against his broad chest. The baby was wrapped in a soft deerskin blanket, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. "She had fever," Dakota said, his English deliberate but clear. "I made tea from elderberry and willow bark. She drinks, then sleeps calm." Sarah tried to stand, but found her legs unwilling to cooperate. The man rose in one fluid motion and crossed to her, gently placing Emma in her trembling arms. The warm weight of her daughter sent relief flooding through Sarah's body. "Thank you," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she examined Emma's face. The bluish tinge that had frightened her so badly on the mountain was gone. Her daughter's cheeks were pink again, her breathing steady and strong. "You have 2 days of sleep," Dakota said, turning away to stir something in a pot hanging over the fire. "The storm still sings outside. No traveling." Sarah glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall in a thick white curtain. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, but inside the air was warm and carried the rich scent of something savory cooking. "My name is Sarah," she said, suddenly aware of how strange it was to be in this stranger's home, accepting his help without even introducing herself. "Sarah Calloway, and this is Emma." Dakota nodded, but didn't immediately respond. He ladled steaming broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to her, along with a carved spoon. "Dakota Two Rivers," he finally said, watching as she balanced the bowl carefully in one hand while holding Emma with the other. "This is my grandfather's land." Sarah sipped the broth, rich with wild game and unfamiliar herbs that warmed her from the inside. Questions tumbled through her mind, but exhaustion still weighed on her limbs. She examined her surroundings properly for the first time. The cabin was small, but meticulously organized. A bed of furs where she now sat, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with glass jars of dried plants and berries. Weapons hung on one wall, a rifle, a bow, several knives. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling rafters. Everything had purpose, nothing wasted. "I was trying to reach Pinewood," Sarah explained between sips. "My sister lives there. After James died..." Her voice caught, the grief still raw 7 months later. "After my husband died, I couldn't afford our place in Denver anymore." Dakota's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his dark eyes at the mention of her loss. "Pinewood is 4 days' walk when no snow falls," he said. "Now, impossible until spring thaw." The reality of her situation crashed over Sarah. "But I can't..." She looked around helplessly. "I can't stay here. I've already imposed..." "Winter gives no choice," Dakota interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than unkind. "Mountain decides who stays, who goes. Now it says, stay." Emma stirred against her chest, tiny fingers flexing as she began to wake. Sarah's body responded immediately, a familiar ache in her breasts, signaling it was time to feed her daughter. A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. Sensing her discomfort, Dakota stood and moved toward the door. "I checked traps," he said simply. "Return soon. After he had gone, Sarah leaned back against the wall, emotions overwhelming her. Gratitude, fear, uncertainty all swirled together as Emma nursed hungrily. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but for the first time in days, they were safe and warm. When Dakota returned an hour later, stomping snow from his boots, Sarah had managed to stand and was slowly walking the perimeter of the cabin, soothing Emma, who fussed in her arms. "Your clothes dry there," Dakota said, pointing to her things laid near the fire. "I have extra moccasins, your boots." He made a gesture that needed no translation. Her city boots hadn't been made for mountain winter. Sarah nodded, a strange new reality settling over her. This man, this stranger who lived alone on a mountain, now held their lives in his hands, and for reasons she couldn't yet understand, he seemed willing to carry that burden. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why help us?" Dakota was silent for so long, Sarah thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than meeting her eyes. "My wife, Kimi, my son, Ahote." His voice grew quieter. 7 winters ago, no one found them in storm. The days blended together as the storm raged outside, transforming the mountainside into an impenetrable white fortress. Inside the cabin, an uneasy rhythm developed between its reluctant inhabitants. Dakota moved like a shadow, efficient and silent, his presence powerful even in stillness. Sarah watched him from the corner of her eye as he skinned rabbits from his traps, sorted dried herbs into precise piles, and carved small wooden figures by firelight. They spoke little, the silence broken mainly by Emma's cries or coos. Yet in that shared space, words became less necessary with each passing day. Sarah learned to read Dakota's slight nod when the stew she prepared met his approval, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when Emma grasped his finger in her tiny fist. One evening, as wind rattled the cabin's sturdy frame, Sarah found the courage to break their comfortable silence. "How long have you lived here alone?" she asked, rocking Emma against her shoulder. Dakota's hands paused over the arrowhead he was sharpening. 7 winters, 2 summers. Sarah's brow furrowed. "But that's after they died. I traveled, worked logging camps in Oregon, ranch hand in Montana." His voice remained steady, but his shoulders tensed. "The mountain called me back." "And your people?" Sarah asked gently. "Your family?" "Apache from Southern Territories originally. My grandfather settled here after the wars." Dakota set down his work and looked directly at her. "Your turn. Your husband. How did he leave this world?" The directness of the question startled her, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only a recognition of shared grief. "Training accident at Fort Carson. Artillery misfire." Sarah swallowed hard. James never even met Emma. She was born 2 months after the funeral. Dakota nodded slowly. "Children should know their father's stories." "What will I tell her?" Sarah whispered, looking down at Emma's sleeping face. "That he liked terrible jokes? That he sang off-key in the shower? That he painted my toenails once when I was too pregnant to reach them?" A sound escaped Dakota then. Not quite a laugh, more like the creek ice breaking in sudden thaw. "Those are good stories. True stories." The next morning, Sarah woke to find the cabin empty except for Emma, who slept peacefully in the small cradle Dakota had fashioned from pine. Panic fluttered in her chest until she spotted a note scratched on birch bark near the fire. "Hunting, back by Sun Middle." With privacy for the first time in days, Sarah took stock of herself. Her body felt stronger, though her ribs still pressed too prominently against her skin. Her hands, once soft from city life, were reddened and chapped. Motherhood had already begun transforming her, and now survival was reshaping her further. Sarah bathed using melted snow water, savoring the simple luxury of cleanliness. She washed her hair with soap that smelled of pine, made by Dakota's own hands. As she dressed in the clothes he'd provided, buckskin leggings and a thick woolen shirt, she caught her reflection in a small mirror hanging by the door. A stranger looked back at her, thinner, wilder, with something new in her eyes. When Dakota returned, dragging a field-dressed deer on a makeshift sled, Sarah was waiting. She had tidied the cabin, prepared a pot of pine needle tea, and laid out clean cloths for the meat. His surprise registered only as a slight pause in his step. Then, without a word, he nodded toward the deer. Sarah stepped forward, knife in hand, and Dakota began to teach. The hide must be stretched properly, he explained, demonstrating the technique. Every part has purpose. We honor the deer's sacrifice by wasting nothing. Sarah's hands trembled but grew steadier as she worked alongside him. When Emma began to cry, Dakota continued the task without comment, while Sarah nursed her daughter. "I want to learn," Sarah said when she returned. "Everything you can teach me. If we're going to survive here until spring, I need to pull my weight." Dakota studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "Tomorrow we begin with snares," he finally said. "And tracking. The mountain provides, but only to those who understand her language." That night, as snow continued to fall in the darkness beyond their shelter, Sarah realized that for the first time since James died, she had gone a full day without being consumed by grief or fear. Instead, her mind was filled with new knowledge, the proper way to stretch a hide, the rich variety of uses for deer tallow, the gentle strength in Dakota's hands as he guided hers. The storm finally broke after 2 weeks of confinement, leaving behind a transformed world. Morning light reflected blindingly off the pristine snow, the sky an impossible blue above the white-capped pines. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin, Emma wrapped against her chest in a carrier Dakota had fashioned from soft deerskin, and breathed deeply of the crisp, clean air. "Today we walk," Dakota announced, appearing beside her with snowshoes in hand. "You must learn the mountain if you are to survive here." Sarah eyed the strange contraptions warily. "I've never used those before." "Then today is good day to start," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. The lessons began immediately. How to secure the bindings without removing her mittens. How to distribute her weight to stay atop the snow rather than sinking. How to balance with Emma against her chest. Sarah fell repeatedly during those first attempts, snow finding its way down her collar and into her boots. But Dakota never sighed in impatience, never suggested she return to the cabin's safety. Instead, he demonstrated again and again, his movements fluid and natural, until Sarah managed several steps without faltering. "There," he said when she finally completed a small circle without falling. "The mountain begins to know your step." They ventured farther from the cabin each day. Dakota showed her how to identify animal tracks in the snow, the delicate prints of foxes, the heart-shaped hooves of deer, the snowshoe pattern of hares. He taught her to read the sky for weather changes, to recognize which trees offered emergency shelter, which plants remained edible beneath the snow. "How do you know all this?" Sarah asked one afternoon as they rested beneath a massive pine, Emma sleeping soundly in her carrier. "My grandfather walked these mountains with me from when I was small enough to carry, like your Emma." Dakota's expression softened with memory. "He taught me as his father taught him." "And you would have taught your son," Sarah said quietly. Dakota looked away, his profile sharp against the snow. "Yes, Ahote would be learning the winter hunting grounds now. He would be 9. Something in Sarah's heart ached for this man who spoke of lost futures with such quiet dignity. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her gloved hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Dakota's dark eyes met hers, something vulnerable flickering briefly within them. Then he nodded once and rose to his feet. "Come, I show you something important." He led her deeper into the forest, to a small clearing where a circle of stones protruded from the snow. In the center stood a weathered wooden post carved with symbols Sarah didn't recognize. "This is sacred place," Dakota explained. "My grandfather's father built this prayer circle when he first claimed this mountain as home. I come here to listen when the world speaks too loudly." Sarah understood this was no small gift, sharing this private sanctuary with an outsider. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me." That evening, as they prepared dinner together in companionable silence, Emma began to fuss inconsolably. Sarah paced the cabin, bouncing and shushing, but nothing calmed the infant. "May I?" Dakota asked after nearly an hour of Emma's distress. Exhausted and frustrated, Sarah carefully transferred her daughter into his arms. To her amazement, Dakota began to sing, a low, melodic chant in his native tongue. His deep voice filled the cabin with sounds ancient and soothing. Emma's cries gradually subsided as she stared up at him with wide, curious eyes. "What are you singing to her?" Sarah asked, watching in wonder. "An old song for protecting little ones." Dakota continued to rock gently, his large hands cradling Emma with astonishing tenderness. "My mother sang it, her mother before." "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "She likes your voice too," Dakota said. "I hear you sing to her at night." Sarah flushed. "I didn't know you could hear that." "Cabin walls are thin," he replied, "but it is good sound. Reminds me that life continues." As January yielded to February, Sarah grew stronger and more capable. Her hands became calloused from work, her legs steady on snowshoes. She learned to tend the traps, to preserve meat, to identify which wood burned cleanest. Emma thrived too, growing plump on her mother's milk, strengthened by the mountain air during their daily excursions. Yet beneath the surface of their newfound routine, Sarah sensed a tension building, not between her and Dakota, but within herself. Each new skill mastered, each day survived in this harsh wilderness, pulled her further from the life she had planned and toward something unknown. One night, as Emma slept soundly and Dakota whittled by the fire, the question that had been building inside her finally found voice. "What happens when spring comes?" Sarah asked softly. "When the paths to Pinewood clear?" Dakota's hands stilled on the wooden figure he was carving. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling flames and Emma's soft breathing from her cradle. "When spring comes," he finally said, his voice low, "you decide. Mountain Road to Pinewood will open by April's end." Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. The answer was practical, direct, like everything about Dakota, yet she felt a hollow ache form beneath her ribs at the thought of leaving this cabin and the man who had saved them. "And if we stayed?" The question escaped before she could consider its implications. Dakota looked up then, their eyes meeting across the small space that had become their shared world. Something flickered in his gaze, surprise perhaps, or a carefully guarded hope. "This is hard life," he said simply. "Not what you knew before." "The life I knew before is gone," Sarah replied, her voice stronger than she expected. "James is gone. Our apartment in Denver, the job I had at the library, the future we planned, all of it disappeared the moment that telegram arrived." Emma stirred in her sleep, and Sarah automatically reached to rock the cradle gently. "The only certainty I have left is her. And she's thriving here, Dakota. We both are." "Your sister waits in Pinewood," he reminded her, though his tone carried no judgment. "Beth has her own life. Her husband, their 3 children in that tiny house." Sarah sighed. "I was going there because I had nowhere else, not because it was right," Takoda nodded slowly, returning his attention to the carving in his hands. Only now did Sarah notice it was taking the shape of a small bear. "You have time to decide," he said. "Mountain will hold us until then." The conversation shifted to other things: the need to repair one of the traps, plans to smoke the last of the venison. But Sarah felt something fundamental had changed between them. A possibility had been acknowledged, a door left purposefully open. February deepened, bringing days of brutal cold interspersed with fresh snowfall. Sarah's education continued. Takoda taught her to read the subtle changes in the forest that heralded the distant approach of spring, though winter's grip remained firm on the mountain. "See here," he said one morning, pointing to a seemingly ordinary pine branch. "New growth, very small. Tree knows spring comes, even when we cannot feel it." On a particularly clear afternoon, Takoda led Sarah to a ridge overlooking the valley below. The view stole her breath, endless waves of pine-covered mountains stretching toward the horizon, their slopes glittering with snow in the sunlight. "There," Takoda pointed toward a distant cluster of buildings, barely visible as specks in the vast landscape. "Pinewood." Sarah squinted, shading her eyes against the glare. The town seemed impossibly small and far away, like a different world entirely. "And your cabin?" she asked, turning to scan the mountainside around them. "Just below that outcropping of rocks," he said, indicating a spot halfway up the adjacent slope. "My grandfather chose well. Protected from winds, near to spring that never freezes." "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "All of it." "Yes," Takoda agreed. But when Sarah glanced at him, she found him watching not the landscape, but her face, his expression thoughtful. That night, a fierce storm descended without warning, bringing howling winds that made the cabin creak and groan like a living thing. Emma, disturbed by the noise, wailed inconsolably. Sarah paced with her, offering comfort that couldn't compete with the storm's fury. "Here," Takoda said, reaching for Emma. "I will walk with her. You rest." Too exhausted to protest, Sarah surrendered her daughter to his capable hands. Takoda cradled Emma against his chest, his large palm supporting her tiny head, and began to walk the perimeter of the cabin, speaking softly in Apache. Sarah meant to rest for just a moment on the bed of furs, but exhaustion claimed her completely. When she woke, the storm had quieted, and pale morning light filtered through the window. She found Takoda seated in his chair, Emma still in his arms, both of them asleep. The sight squeezed something in Sarah's chest. This powerful man who hunted elk and faced blizzards without flinching, so gentle with her daughter. His face softened in sleep. In that moment, she could see clearly what Takoda must have been like as a father, what he'd lost when Ahote was taken from him. She rose quietly, taking care not to wake them, and rekindled the fire. As she prepared breakfast, Sarah found herself humming softly, an old lullaby her own mother had sung, the same one she often sang to Emma. The simple melody filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling flames. Takoda's eyes opened, finding hers across the room. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, an understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the family they were unexpectedly becoming. March arrived with deceptive gentleness, bringing days of brilliant sunshine that melted the snow's surface by afternoon, only to freeze it into treacherous ice by nightfall. The forest began to stir with renewed life. Chickadees called more frequently, deer ventured from the sheltered valleys to browse on emerging buds, and the creek's ice cracked and groaned as water flowed stronger beneath. Sarah marked the changes in a small journal Takoda had fashioned for her from deerskin and handmade paper. Each evening, she recorded what they'd seen, what she'd learned, and Emma's small milestones. Her first attempts to roll over, the strengthening of her grip, the way her eyes tracked movement with growing awareness. "You're building her story," Dakota observed one night, watching Sarah's pencil move across the page. "I want to remember everything," she replied without looking up. "For her sake, but also for mine. I never want to forget a single day of this." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by Emma's occasional coos from her cradle and the soft scratching of Sarah's pencil. Such quiet moments had become precious to Sarah. No expectations, no need to fill the air with empty words, just peaceful coexistence. Their routine had evolved into something like partnership. They rose with the sun, sharing morning tasks, Dakota tending the fire and checking traps while Sarah prepared breakfast and cared for Emma. Their days were filled with the work of survival, but increasingly there were moments of simple joy, teaching Sarah to shoot Dakota's old Winchester rifle, tracking a mother fox and her new kits, discovering the first tiny wildflowers pushing through melting snow. One morning, Sarah woke to find the cabin empty except for Emma. Outside, Dakota was splitting wood, his powerful strokes regular as a heartbeat. She watched him through the window, struck by how familiar his movements had become to her, how essential his presence in their lives. He paused, sensing her gaze, and looked up. Their eyes met through the glass, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm despite the chill air. She raised her hand in greeting, and he returned the gesture before resuming his work. Later that day, as they checked fishing lines at the half-frozen creek, Sarah slipped on the treacherous ice. Dakota's hand shot out, catching her elbow, steadying her against him. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth of his breath, see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, reluctant to step away. Dakota's hand lingered on her arm. "Be careful," he said softly. "Ice is deceptive this time of year." That evening, Emma developed a sudden fever. Her tiny face flushed red, her cries turned weak and pitiful. Panic gripped Sarah's heart as she held her daughter's burning body. "She was fine this morning," Sarah said, her voice cracking with fear. "What's happening to her?" Dakota assessed the situation with calm urgency. His large hand gently examined Emma, feeling her glands, checking her breathing. "Bring clean cloth and cold water," he instructed, already reaching for his medicine pouch. Through the night, they worked together to bring Emma's fever down. Dakota prepared infusions of elderberry and willow bark, showing Sarah how to administer tiny amounts to the fussing infant. Sarah bathed Emma's overheated skin with cool cloths, while Dakota burned sage and cedar, filling the cabin with aromatic smoke. "My son had fevers often," he explained, as they took turns walking with Emma. "His lungs were never strong." Sarah heard the pain beneath his matter-of-fact tone and reached for his hand. "You were a good father, Dakota." He looked down at their joined hands. "I tried to be. Sometimes trying is not enough." "It's all any of us can do," she whispered, thinking of her own fears of inadequacy, the constant worry that she wasn't enough for Emma. By dawn, Emma's fever had broken. She slept peacefully against Sarah's chest, her breathing normal once more. Exhausted but relieved, Sarah leaned against the cabin wall, her eyes growing heavy despite her determination to remain vigilant. She felt Dakota settle beside her, his shoulder touching hers. "Sleep," he murmured. "I will watch over you both." Sarah hesitated only briefly before allowing her head to rest against his shoulder. The solid strength of him, the cedar scent of his skin, created a sense of safety she hadn't felt since James died, perhaps even before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." His only answer was to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. In that small gesture was a tenderness that spoke volumes in their shared language of unspoken things. The last snow of the season fell in early April, gentle wet flakes that clung briefly to emerging buds before dissolving into droplets that sparkled in the strengthening sun. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the transformation with mixed emotions. The mountain was revealing itself anew, shedding its white mantle to expose rich earth and tender green growth. With each passing day, the path to Pinewood became more accessible, the future decision more pressing. Emma, now nearly 6 months old, sat propped against Sarah's hip, babbling and reaching for falling snowflakes. Her dark eyes, so like her father's, took in the world with growing curiosity. She had changed dramatically in their months on the mountain, no longer the fragile newborn who had nearly perished in the storm, but a sturdy infant with quick smiles and strong lungs. "She knows spring," Dakota said, appearing silently beside them as he often did. "See how she watches the birds returning." Sarah nodded, still marveling at how Dakota noticed such things. The subtle connections between all living beings, the small wonders that most people overlooked. "I received a message from Thomas at the trading post," he continued. "He hiked up yesterday while you were collecting pine nuts." Sarah turned to him in surprise. She hadn't known anyone had visited. "The road to Pinewood will be clear enough for travel in 2 weeks." Dakota's voice remained neutral, but Sarah could sense the tension beneath his words. "He can arrange transportation for you and Emma when you are ready." The statement hung in the air between them, forcing into the open what they had both been avoiding. April was ending. A decision could no longer be postponed. "I should write to my sister," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She must believe we died in the storm." Dakota nodded once. "Thomas will carry a letter down on his next supply run." That evening, Sarah sat at the table with a sheet of precious paper before her, pencil poised but motionless. How could she possibly explain the past months to Beth? What words could capture the transformation she had undergone, the life she and Emma had found on this mountain with this man? Outside, Dakota was teaching Emma to feel different tree barks, holding her tiny hand against rough pine, smooth aspen, papery birch. Her delighted giggles drifted through the open window, tightening Sarah's throat with emotion. "Dearest Beth," she finally wrote, the words coming slowly at first, then faster. "I know you must have feared the worst when we never arrived. The storm caught us on the mountain road, and we would surely have perished if not for the kindness of a stranger who has since become family." She paused, considering the word she'd chosen. Family. Was that what they had become? This unlikely trio bound by circumstance and survival? "Emma is thriving in ways I could never have imagined. She has the entire forest as her nursery and has never known the restrictions of city walls. And I..." Sarah stared out the window, watching as Dakota lifted Emma high so she could touch a pine branch, his strong hands gentle around her small body, his face tilted up to watch her reaction. "I have found strength I never knew I possessed and peace I never thought possible after losing James." She completed the letter without addressing her plans, sealing it with the uncertainty still unresolved in her own heart. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Dakota already gone, his bed furs neatly rolled. A small wooden carving sat on the table, a perfect miniature fox, detailed down to its alert ears and bushy tail. Beside it lay a map drawn on birch bark, marking a trail leading to a place labeled simply Sunrise Point. Emma was unusually cooperative as Sarah dressed her and prepared a small pack with food and water. Following Dakota's map, they hiked along a narrow trail that wound through fresh-scented pines and across meadows where early wildflowers painted the landscape in purple and yellow brushstrokes. The path climbed steadily until it emerged onto a rocky outcropping. There, seated with his back to her, was Dakota. Beyond him stretched a view so magnificent it drew a gasp from Sarah's lips. The entire valley spread below them, mountains rising in the distance, the forest a patchwork of greens and browns, and far below, the silver ribbon of a river catching the morning light. Takoda turned at the sound of her approach, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. "You found the way." "Your map was perfect," Sarah replied, adjusting Emma in her carrier. "This place—" Takoda gestured to the vista before them. "My grandfather brought me here when I was a boy. He said, 'When you need to make big decisions, come to where you can see far.'" Sarah understood then why he had directed her here, not to influence her choice, but to give her perspective, clarity. "It's where I decided to return after Kimi and Ahote died," he continued, his voice low. "Where I decided to live again, not just survive." He turned to face her fully then, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Sarah," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips felt intimate, important. "What I want does not matter. What matters is what you and Emma need. And if what we need is you—" The words escaped before she could reconsider them, honest and unplanned. Something shifted in Takoda's expression, a softening, a vulnerability rarely revealed. "Then I am here," he said simply. "I will always be here." Emma chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching her chubby arms toward Takoda with unmistakable intent. Sarah transferred her daughter to him, watching as his large hands cradled her with familiar ease, as Emma patted his face with comfortable affection. The sight clarified something Sarah had been struggling to acknowledge. In this wild place, with this quiet, strong man, she and Emma had found not just survival, but belonging. The days that followed held a new quality, a sense of possibility rather than impending separation. Sarah found herself studying the cabin with fresh eyes, imagining small improvements that would make it more suitable for raising a child. Takoda seemed to read her thoughts, returning one afternoon with saplings he'd cut to expand the single room. "For Emma," he explained as he laid out his plan, "she will need her own space as she grows." They worked side by side, Takoda showing Sarah how to notch logs and seal joints with pine pitch. Emma watched from a nest of blankets, occasionally entertaining herself by chewing on a smooth piece of antler Takoda had polished for her teething pains. "In my tribe," Takoda said as they worked, "when a child reaches walking age, the community gathers to build their first moccasins together. Each family contributes, one the hide, another the sinew, others the beadwork." "That's beautiful," Sarah replied, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow. "Everyone investing in the child's journey." Takoda nodded, his hands never stopping their methodical work. "The path is easier when many help prepare for it." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Sarah understood he was offering not just shelter, but community, a different kind than she had known before, but perhaps one Emma needed more. Their quiet planning was interrupted 3 days later, when Thomas from the trading post arrived unexpectedly, his usually cheerful face tense with concern. "Riders coming up from Pinewood," he announced without preamble after Takoda invited him inside. "Sheriff and 3 men. They're asking about a missing woman and baby." Sarah's heart clenched. "My sister must have reported us missing when we never arrived." Thomas nodded, accepting the cup of pine needle tea Sarah offered. Sheriff showed a photograph, said the woman's name is Sarah Calloway. "What did you tell them?" Takoda asked, his voice carefully neutral. Thomas glanced between them, reading the situation with perceptive eyes. "Told them I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. But Takoda..." He hesitated. "Ben Harper was with them. He knows these mountains better than most. If they keep searching, they'll find this cabin eventually." After Thomas left, promising to delay the search party if possible, a heavy silence descended. Emma, sensing the tension, fussed in her cradle until Sarah lifted her, pressing her face into her daughter's soft hair. "They're looking for us," she said unnecessarily, her thoughts racing. Would they force her to leave? Could they? You have done nothing wrong, Dakota said, standing at the window, scanning the forest below. You are free to choose your path. But they might not see it that way. Sarah's voice trembled slightly. A white woman living with, they might make assumptions. Dakota turned to her, his expression unreadable. Do you want to be found, Sarah? The question cut through her confusion, forcing her to confront what she truly wanted. No, she said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. This is our home now. Emma's home. I don't want to leave. Something shifted in Dakota's posture, a release of tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He crossed to where she stood with Emma and, after a moment's hesitation, placed his hand against her cheek. Then we will face them together, he said simply. They prepared through the night, not to flee, but to welcome the inevitable visitors. Sarah baked cornbread from their precious stores of meal, while Dakota hung his military service papers where they would be easily visible. The cabin was tidied, Emma bathed and dressed in the cleanest clothes they had. They will have questions, Dakota warned as dawn approached. Sarah nodded, steeling herself. Let them ask. We have nothing to hide. The riders appeared mid-morning, 4 men on horseback emerging from the forest into the clearing. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin, Emma on her hip, while Dakota remained slightly behind them, a solid, reassuring presence. The sheriff, a weathered man with graying temples, dismounted first. His eyes widened in recognition as he took in Sarah and the baby. Mrs. Calloway, he called, approaching slowly. Your sister Beth has been searching for you since January. She feared you'd perished in the storm. Sarah stepped forward, chin raised. As you can see, Sheriff, we're very much alive and well, thanks to Mr. Two Rivers. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Dakota, his expression hardening slightly. One of the other riders, a lean, hawk-faced man Sarah assumed was Ben Harper, spat on the ground. Ma'am, the sheriff said carefully, perhaps we could speak privately? Anything you have to say can be said in front of Dakota, Sarah replied firmly. He saved our lives. He's given us a home. The sheriff removed his hat, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Calloway, your sister is mighty worried. She's prepared a place for you and the little one in Pinewood. That's very kind of Beth, Sarah said, bouncing Emma gently as she began to fuss. And I appreciate your concern in coming all this way, but Emma and I won't be going to Pinewood. The hawk-faced man made a dismissive sound. She's been up here alone with this Injun all winter, probably not thinking straight. Sarah felt Dakota tense behind her, but his voice when he spoke was calm and measured. Mrs. Calloway is free to leave whenever she wishes. The road has been passable for several days now. The sheriff studied them both, his eyes lingering on Emma, then on the cabin's expansion clearly underway. Is this truly what you want, ma'am? He asked Sarah directly, his tone softer. Your husband's only been gone a year. The question might have stung once, but now Sarah felt only certainty. James would have wanted Emma and me to be safe and happy, she said. We are both here with Dakota. The sheriff's departure left a palpable tension hanging in the mountain air. Sarah watched the riders disappear into the trees, Emma squirming against her hip, and felt the weight of her declaration settling around them like a new season. They will talk, Dakota said quietly, standing beside her as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Let them, Sarah replied, finding strength in her decision that surprised even her. Words can't harm what we've built here. But words, they soon discovered, carried farther than expected in these mountains. Thomas arrived a week later with supplies and news from Pinewood. The town was ablaze with gossip about the widow Calloway living in sin with an Indian, as the more judgmental residents put it. Beth came to the trading post, Thomas told them as they unloaded flour and salt from his pack mule. Wanted me to give you this. He handed Sarah an envelope, her name written in her sister's familiar sloping handwriting. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The letter inside was brief but not unkind. Beth expressed relief that Sarah and Emma had survived, confusion about her choices, but ultimately a sister's tentative support. I cannot pretend to understand the life you've chosen, Beth wrote, but Mother always said you had a will of your own. If you and Emma are truly happy and well cared for, that is what matters most. The door to our home remains open should you ever change your mind. At the bottom was a postscript. Your things arrived from Denver last month. I've asked Thomas to bring what he can carry of Emma's baby clothes and your photographs. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she looked up to see Thomas unloading a small trunk from his mule. Inside were remnants of her previous life. The silver-framed photograph of James in his uniform, Emma's christening gown, the quilt Sarah's grandmother had stitched for her wedding. Beth said there's more whenever you want it, Thomas explained, though she hopes you'll come fetch it yourself someday. That night, after Thomas had gone and Emma was asleep, Sarah spread the items across the cabin floor. Dakota watched silently as she traced her fingers over James's photograph, her expression a complex mixture of grief and acceptance. He was handsome, Dakota observed quietly. He had kind eyes. He would have been a wonderful father, Sarah agreed, looking up to meet Dakota's gaze. But Emma will know his story, and she'll have you to teach her things James never could. Dakota knelt beside her, carefully lifting the silver frame. In my tradition, we do not speak the names of the dead, fearing it might call their spirits when they should be journeying onward. But I think your way has wisdom too. Emma should know the man who gave her life, and the man who saved it, Sarah added softly, who saved us both. Something shifted between them in that moment, a final barrier dissolving. Dakota's hand found hers among the scattered possessions, their fingers intertwining as naturally as roots beneath the forest floor. The next morning, Dakota rose before dawn and left without explanation. When he returned mid-afternoon, he carried a small bundle wrapped in soft hide. "For Emma," he said, placing it in Sarah's hands, "and for you, if you wish to accept." Sarah unwrapped the package to find 2 items, a delicate bracelet of polished wooden beads and tiny shells, and beside it a larger matching band. "In my tribe," Dakota explained, his usual confidence giving way to an uncharacteristic hesitancy. "When a man asks a woman to join her life with his, he offers these. The smaller one is for her first daughter, to connect the generations." Sarah's heart quickened as she understood what he was offering, not just a home, but a family bound by choice rather than circumstance, a future deliberately shared. "Among my people," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, "the woman gives her answer like this." She stepped forward, closing the space between them, and placed her hand against his cheek. Dakota remained perfectly still as Sarah rose onto her toes and pressed her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief, but held the promise of 1,000 more to follow. When Sarah drew back, Dakota's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if memorizing the sensation. "Yes," she whispered simply. That evening, Dakota built a special fire in the clearing before their cabin. He explained that among his people, unions were celebrated by the sharing of smoke and prayer, witnessed by ancestors and sky. Together they stood in the firelight, Emma cradled between them as Dakota spoke words in Apache that Sarah couldn't understand, but felt in the depths of her soul. She responded with the vows she remembered from her faith, words of commitment and partnership that transcended any single tradition. As the stars emerged above them, Dakota tied the beaded bracelet around Sarah's wrist, and together they secured the smaller one on Emma's tiny arm. "Now we are three," he said, his voice resonant with emotion rarely displayed. "One family under these stars." Sarah looked up at the man who had saved them from the storm, who had taught her strength she never knew she possessed, whose quiet love had healed wounds she thought would never mend. "One family," she echoed, and in those words was a future neither of them could have imagined when winter first brought them together. 5 summers passed on the mountain, each season bringing its own gifts and challenges to the family that had formed in the shadow of what should have been tragedy. The cabin expanded twice more, first to add a proper bedroom for Emma, and later to welcome Thomas Two Rivers Calloway, born during the maple syrup harvest of their 3rd spring together. The clearing around their home now boasted a thriving garden, a small corral for the mare and colt Dakota had traded furs to acquire, and a workshop where he crafted furniture that Thomas sold at the trading post for a growing reputation. Sarah's knowledge of medicinal plants had expanded beyond even Dakota's teaching. Women from Pinewood occasionally made the journey up the mountain trail to seek her remedies and wisdom. On this particular afternoon, the family gathered by the creek where summer's heat drove them to cool their feet in the rushing water. Emma, now 5½, her dark hair in 2 braids secured with beads Dakota had carved, carefully arranged stones in the shallows to create pools where minnows gathered. "Look, little brother," she instructed Thomas, who watched with solemn fascination from his perch on Sarah's lap. "The fish like the quiet water behind the rocks." The 2-year-old boy, a perfect blend of his parents with Dakota's deep eyes and Sarah's dimpled smile, stretched chubby fingers toward the flashing silver bodies. "Fish," he repeated carefully, looking to his father for approval. Dakota nodded, the corners of his eyes crinkling with quiet pride. "Good word, son." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment washing over her like the gentle current around their feet. The years had changed them all. Her hands were now as calloused as Dakota's, her skin burnished by mountain sun, her body stronger than it had ever been in city life. Dakota spoke more, laughed more, the deep silences that once defined him, now punctuated by stories told to eager children or quiet conversations with Sarah under starlight. "We should start back," Sarah suggested as the sun began its descent behind the western ridge. "Beth and Robert will arrive before dark." The mention of her sister brought a smile to Sarah's face. What had begun as cautious, twice-yearly visits had evolved into a genuine friendship between the 2 families. Beth's initial wariness of Dakota had given way to respect, then affection, as she witnessed the life they'd built together. As they gathered their things, a rider appeared on the trail, Thomas from the trading post, his mule laden with mail and supplies. "Thought I'd catch you before you headed in," he called, dismounting with practiced ease despite his advancing years. "Got a letter from Denver that seemed important." Sarah accepted the envelope, immediately recognizing the government seal. Her heart quickened as she broke it open, scanning the official text with growing disbelief. "What is it?" Dakota asked, noting her expression. "It's from the Department of War," she said, her voice catching. "James's pension. They've reviewed my case and reconsidered. They're granting benefits to both Emma and me, retroactive to his death." "What does it mean?" Emma asked, pressing against her mother's side, always sensitive to emotional shifts. Sarah knelt to her daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It means your first father is still taking care of you, sweet girl, even from heaven." That evening, as Beth and Robert's wagon rolled into the clearing, the mountain home blazed with welcome. Lanterns hung from porch posts, venison roasted on the fire pit Dakota had built, and the scent of Sarah's wild berry pie drifted on the summer air. The reunion was warm, filled with news exchanged and children's accomplishments proudly shared. After dinner, while the men discussed the construction of a proper road to improve access to the higher elevations, Sarah and Beth walked to the edge of the clearing, arms linked as they had done as girls. "I was wrong, you know," Beth said suddenly, breaking their companionable silence. "When the sheriff returned and told us you decided to stay, I thought you'd lost your mind. I couldn't imagine how this could be the right choice for you and Emma." Sarah smiled, watching as Dakota demonstrated to Robert's sons how to identify constellations. Emma perched on his shoulders to better see the night sky. "It wasn't what I planned," she admitted, "but sometimes life takes away the path you thought you'd travel and forces you to find a new one." "A better one, it seems," Beth observed, squeezing her sister's arm affectionately. Later, after their guests had settled into the guest room and the children were asleep, Sarah and Dakota sat on the porch steps, sharing the peaceful darkness as they often did. "The pension money," Sarah said quietly. "We could use it to build that proper schoolhouse you've been planning, for Emma and Thomas, but also for the children from the Arapaho settlement who have nowhere to learn." Dakota took her hand, running his thumb over the beaded bracelet she still wore. "James continues to protect his family and now others as well. He must have been a good man." "He was," Sarah agreed, "just as you are. Our children are blessed to have the legacy of both." Dakota looked out across the clearing where they had built their life together, his expression thoughtful. "When I found you that day in the snow, I was a man who had forgotten how to live. I had food, shelter, skills to survive, but my heart was as cold as the mountain winter." Sarah leaned into him, knowing how rare it still was for him to speak so openly of his feelings. "And now?" she prompted gently. "Now I understand what my grandfather meant when he told me that sometimes the greatest wounds can lead to the greatest healing if we are brave enough to keep our hearts open." The night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket as Dakota pulled Sarah closer. Above them, stars spangled the vast Colorado sky, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning, their struggles, their enduring love. Emma's bracelet gleamed on her small wrist as she slept inside. Thomas curled beside his sister as he often was, seeking her protection and warmth. In sleep, the children's hands remained linked, much like their parents' hearts, bound together by choice, by circumstance, by a love that had survived the harshest winter and flourished in the seasons that followed. The mountain that had once nearly claimed their lives now cradled their family in its ancient embrace, a testament to the resilience of those who dare to begin again when all seems lost. And in the whisper of the night wind through the pines came the promise that had sustained them through it all. "You'll both live here now. This mountain has room for brave spirits like yours."